Let me just begin by introducing myself. My name is Ifad Idris. I'm a research fellow at the Governance and Social Development Research GSDRC. Welcome to today's webinar. This is the 8th in a series of events that GSDRC has been organising for the UK Department for International Development, or DFID. These webinars are part of a range of development products that GSDRC has been producing for DFID staff. Others include reading packs, e-learning materials, topic guides, help desk reports, and other publications. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and recordings of all our webinars are available on the GSDRC website, along with the various publications and products that I mentioned. Okay, the topic of today's webinar is religion, conflict, and violent extremism. The role of religion in international relations and its relationship with conflict is increasingly acknowledged, but it remains disputed. And the challenge is identifying a suitable lens to understand and to tackle religion in both domestic and international policy areas. Similar uncertainty prevails around violent extremism. Is it always carried out by non-state actors? Does it always have to be ideological? How do you distinguish between violent extremism and other conflict actors in conflict situations, and so on? Today's discussion will examine these concepts of religion, conflict, and violent extremism, and address questions such as: in what ways do religious leaders to exacerbate war and facilitate peace? How can external actors engage with religious actors to promote peace? Can we better understand the relationship between religious belief and violence? Or is religion a red herring? Should we actually be looking at cultural factors? How can we improve the evidence base on researching and writing on violent extremism? And the fact that violent extremism is mostly taking place in Asia and Africa, implications of that for government policy and for development practice. You've got three presenters with us today. Our first presenter is Sara Silvestri. She's Senior Lecturer in the International Politics Department at City University in London. She's also Affiliated Lecturer at Polis at the University of Cambridge. Her research focuses on based actors in European public policy, with a focus on Muslim mobilization and transnationalism, religion and foreign policy, and issues at the intersection of migration, multiculturalism, conflict, and security. Sara has worked in the Cabinet of the European Commission's President and has advised a range of government agencies, including DFID, as well as the UN and the EU, among others. Sara prepared the GSDRC reading pack on religion and conflict. Our second presenter, who is joining us from Mombasa, is Martine Zeuthen. Martine is an anthropologist and a consultant on countering violent extremism, or CVE. She's currently working for the Royal Institute, RUSI, on an EU-funded CVE program in the Horn of Africa. And our third and final presenter is Andrew Glazzard. Andrew is Director of National Security and Research Studies at RUSI, and he's worked on research projects for DFID, for the Home Office and the Ministry of Defence. And Andrew and Martine jointly prepared the GSDRC reading pack on violent extremism. In a moment, I'm going to ask Sara, then Martine, then Andrew to make a short opening presentations, drawing on the reading packs that they prepared for DFID's development program. We'll then give audience members, you, an opportunity to ask them questions. And you can type your questions into the chat box, which you can hopefully see on the right-hand side of your screen. Please note that you don't need to wait until the end of the presentation. You can type in questions as they occur to you. And in addition, if there is a particular presenter that you have in mind who you'd like to answer your question, then please specify that as well. And depending on the number of questions we get, we'll aim to finish in about an hour and a half, so around 1300, 1 o'clock UK time. Okay, let me now hand over to our Sara Silvestri.
Sara, you need to unmute your microphone.
It is a pleasure to be here to participate in this webinar on religion, conflict, and violent extremism. With my opening remarks, I would like to highlight some conceptual parameters that are needed in order to appreciate the relevance of religion in conflict and in extremist situation. And this is what comes from some of the readings I prepared for the reading pack. Basically, it is very important to not come to the field of religion and conflict with any fixed assumptions about what religion is about and how religion plays out in the international arena or in local settings. Because religion is something fluid and something culturally dependent, context dependent. So even though we can identify some key elements that are normally associated to identify what religion is about, such as the centrality of the belief system, the presence of the deity, of rituals, symbols, and traditions, at the end of the day, how religion plays out in local or international settings depends also on the emotional and intellectual linkages between a community of beliefs and actually the reality in which they're living. How religious ideas then are transformed into potentially political ideologies, and how truth emanating from religious scriptures can then be played out and translated into juridical norms or into a political system. A very important element, a crucial element in my view, that sort of highlights the link between politics, conflict, and religion is the feature, a particular feature of religion, in that all religions, regardless of what tradition we are looking at, are providing an understanding of global order according to the belief system that they are producing and that they are emanating. And so it is often this cosmic order, this worldview that religions are projecting, that can either enhance or clash with a particular understanding of law and order, and in particular with existing liberal traditions of what a democratic system is about. So it is not particular qualities or notions or doctrinal items inside religious traditions that are problematic, but actually the way in which they work within the religious system and how this is translated into the real life and how beliefs are lived by the members of religious communities. Secondly, so once we have appreciated how to understand religion, it is also important to to have a holistic understanding of what religion is about, because often in situations of conflict and of violence, of the so-called terrorist, religiously inspired terrorist violence, we see particular religious actors or non-religious actors who take up religious notions, religious symbols, religious discourses. So it is very important to question in each situation we are examining, and in each case where the policymakers have to find a solution, which element of religion is at play there. Is it a religious ideology? Is it a religious symbol? Is it a religious scripture? It is a particular religious actor that is working there. Because depending on which actor or which element is at play, then we can sort of respond to that particular layer of the of religion in an adequate manner. Evidence that has been collected by many researchers around the world points out at two particular issues in this regard. First, most authors agree that very often when we experience, when we witness a so-called religious conflict, very often the religious dimension of that conflict is characterized by the fact that religious elites play with particular religious notions, or political elites, so not members of the religious leadership, take hold of religious traditions and capitalize on religious symbols and religious notions in order to mobilize communities, and then secondly in order to mobilize the religious elites to support their particular discourse. So it is very difficult in those particular situations to point the finger and say actually the key motivator here is a religious leader or a particular religious notions within the doctrinal body, because it is more a matter of seeing how the political leadership mobilizes all these particular elements of religion. And we have to consider, the reasonings behind then the choice of religious elites to support or to fight particular battles, particular causes that are being around which the political leadership or maybe non-state actors have mobilized. The other element we have to, around which most researchers agree, is that it seems inaccurate to point the finger to the role of ideologies when witnessing situations of religious conflict, because ideologies appear to be there as a sort of an element that is mobilized once other structures, when other factors have already facilitated the escalation of violence. So very often the instability of a country, the lack of strong political and administrative structures, or competition between political authorities, between religious authorities, then facilitates the mobilization of religion in the shape of a political ideology that then can lead to engaging in political violence. Most research again shows that in fact the factors such as self-determination or fights for nationalist causes remain the main causes of violence and of conflicts around the world, even if religion has been a factor often present in these nationalist and self-determination struggles, because religion can in a way intensify these particular struggles, because religion can provide a set of discourses, a set of symbols, and again, as I said earlier, religious leaders are often there and can decide to participate in or to fight against this particular nationalist struggle. So they do have a role, but they don't seem to have the leading role in triggering conflicts. Also, one of the readings I propose in my pack argues that religious conflicts, there is no evidence to prove that religious conflicts are more violent than secular conflicts. So this is not something to rejoice about, because at the end of the day, the evidence shows that violence is spreading around the world in an equal manner. But still, there is an element here to disprove the assumption that religion is more prone to producing violence. And in terms of structural factors that can enhance a slippery slope that can lead to the emergence of a religious conflict, I've mentioned instability of a country. It is often the case, as we often see in many parts of, for instance, of Africa these days, but also situations of horizontal inequalities, that is, situations where cultural differences and social conflicts coincide then with political differences and potentially elements that can trigger then political clashes, and then can also lead into so these cultural differences coincide also with religious differences that then in turn can enhance political clashes. In terms of the role of religious leaders or political leaders in promoting and enhancing religious conflict, this has been theorized in terms of religious outbidding. And practically, the dynamics at play are these. Religious language is used to cultivate a particular identity by a position that is by a person, a religious or political leader, who happens to be part of the elite, and therefore is someone who has access to a large amount of human and material resources to mobilize people around him or her, and is a person that typically is particularly skilled, well educated, and is a good communicator, and so has a number of professional skills that then put this person automatically in a visibility position, in a position of high visibility, that then can facilitate then the attraction of the community, of the ordinary members of the religious community to follow this particular political project or attempt to gain power on the part of this person in a leadership position. And often religious outbeing, that is competition through religious terms, is used because again, religious traditions offer the language, and very often in a situation of conflict of where many also political structures have failed to secure the future of a country, religion remains the only element at play in which people have faith, and where it remains basically the only currency available to elaborate on a political project. And so this is facilitating the religious outbidding. So it doesn't mean that religious traditions are the trigger for a conflict, but they provide the elements for opportunistic faith or political leaders to pursue the gain of power. So the presence of religious claims can in turn make religious conflict resolution difficult, but also in terms could be require the use of religious terms in order to participate in the resolution of a conflict. So this doesn't mean, this entails the fact that policymakers and diplomats should be literate enough to appreciate what elements of religion are at play in a particular situation of conflict, and should be able to respond with the adequate language. This doesn't mean that traditional non-religious avenues of conflict resolution should be abandoned. On the contrary, the standard avenues and the standard formats of conflict resolution should still be pursued, so that the blame and the load of work for the solution of the conflict is not put only on the religious actors, because traditional avenues of conflict resolution will appreciate all the other structural factors that are required to be addressed in order to resolve a conflict. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's great, Sara. Thank you. I'm now going to ask our second speaker, Martine, to make a presentation. Martine.
Yeah, thank you. I think my bandwidth is perhaps the lowest, so I'm hoping you can hear me. I'll speak slowly so that it comes through, hopefully. So I'm here to talk a program that we are running at RUSI called STRIVE, Strengthening Resilience to Violent Extremism. And Andrew will be going a lot more into our reading pack after. So the idea is that we bring forward some sort of practical examples of the program that we are running, and he goes more into the reading pack. So basically, STRIVE is a CVE program that was started 2.5 years ago. We are heading into the last 6 months, so it's now that we are drawing up some of the lessons that we've learned, including some of these conversations around how to work with religious actors. So Sara, it was very interesting to hear your perspectives there. The approach that we took to STRIVE was very much that violent extremism cannot be addressed from one angle alone. We have to engage with different people who play different roles in the lives of the young people who are attracted to the use of violence. And it's also tailored according to some of the geographical specificities we have here in the Horn of Africa. The program is focusing on Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia. We're kind of working around 4 particular areas that was identified as key drivers of extremism. The first one is looking at the relationship between law enforcement actors and civil society. where we are basically working with different law enforcement actors who play a role in counterterrorism and train them on prevention issues. And on the other side, we work with civil society organizations to try and help them articulate what is their mandate, what are the vulnerable communities that they can reach out to. And then we bring the two sides together because here in Kenya in particular, of course, excessive use of force and politicization of the use of force are key drivers in the recruitment patterns and the recruitment narratives that Al-Shabaab in particular is using. Then we are working on the role of women. I saw there was a question around that. We look at that in particular in Somalia, to try and understand both women as mothers, sisters, wives. So in the relationship to the young men, how can they be voices of resilience and work with the young people to try and reduce recruitment to South Central and to Al-Shabaab? But also coming from a perspective of the women have an agency also to engage on their own, so trying to understand what is the role of women. Are they hiding weapons? Are they facilitating movement to the south? What is their role in these recruitment patterns? And the whole idea is to see, can we work with civil society organizations that can reach out to the women to enhance their capacity to reduce the recruitment? And another aspect of Al-Shabaab, of course, is the issue of how they use diaspora to come and engage in their violent activities. So we also have a component that focuses on the role of diaspora, and in particular the relationship between local Somalis or Somalis born in Somalia and Somalis born overseas. Who are the ones who are narrating and accepting use of violence, and how do they influence each other? It's very often we see that it's diaspora who are involved in the most spectacular use of violence, whereas the local guys are the ones who are fighting the more sort of bush-type fighting in South Central. The last area, which is mostly relevant to what Sara was talking about on religion, is our approach to youth more broadly. So what we've done is to work on interfaith dialogue, to try and see if that can be a way of reducing intolerance or creating more tolerance in the communities that are affected of recruitment in South Central. And then we've worked a lot on with religious actors that are here in Kenya, and we've very much approached it from a generational perspective, because our research from interviews in 20 to 30 mosques in south coast of Kenya showed that there's a disconnect between the questions that the youth are raising, the answers they're looking for, and the guidance they are hoping to get from their religious leaders, and the messages that the religious leaders are conveying. So we have very much approached that pilot activity from an intergenerational dialogue within the religious community. And then we've tried to work a bit on local radio or local media to try and raise the debate on air, which in particular has focused on raising awareness through using the voice of victims both of counterterrorism and terrorism attacks, to raise awareness and to prevent that other people move to Somalia. And another area that we are working quite a lot on is mentorship, where we are trying to build from the lessons that are from the UK and from Denmark. And in our mentorship program, of course, some of our mentors are also religious leaders. But in general, the idea is to provide an alternative support network to young people who are at risk of being recruited and radicalized. So in all of these pilots, research and data collection is key. Both of us, of course, to understand which kind of approaches can work in CVE, but also because we have to continue to understand how recruitment happens, how is the radicalization going, and how can our interventions fit according to the patterns of that particular time. And one thing that we have found to be extremely important is that we continuously assess who are the young people who are at risk of being recruited. And sometimes they're not that young, and sometimes they're even children. But what are their characteristics? What are the process they are following? And therefore, how can we, with our interventions, engage? so we are constantly trying to assess what are the recruitment patterns and what is the radicalization patterns. For example, right now, I don't know if you've seen the news lately, but there's a lot of conversations around recruitment to ISIS from the Horn of Africa, from in particular some of the higher learning institutions. So if we want to continue to be relevant with our work, of course that means that we have to adapt our activities according to these new lessons that we are learning, and it of course also raises new questions to the Kenyan government and other actors who are involved. So we are very much using the research that we are doing to allow ourselves to adapt our program according to the problem as we are seeing it evolve. Yeah, I think I will stop with that and let Andrew take over, then we can discuss more after. Thank you.
Okay, that's great, Martine. Thank you. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to try and get my PowerPoint to come up on screen. Can I just check that's now visible?
Yep, I can see it. I hope
Okay.
everyone else can.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to join this webinar. Rather than go through the reading pack, which I think should be available to everybody who's attending today, I thought it would actually be more useful to start with a piece of research that we did last year for DFID, and which is, I think, highly relevant to the topics that we're discussing this morning. And what we were asked to do was to research whether specifically Islamist violent extremist groups constituted a new kind of conflict actor. And as part of that question, we then looked at the extent to which Islamist groups influence and are influenced by civil conflicts. The way that we approached this was to do a pretty extensive literature review, and then we looked at 3 case studies, which were Syria and Iraq. We had to combine those 2 countries in one case study. Nigeria and Kenya. And then finally we looked to draw out the implications that differed, so specifically in the area of development responses. And to start with, what we concluded from the literature review was that, if you like, in theory, we could draw Islamist and actually some other violent extremist groups into a fairly neat and elegant schematic, which I'll now sort of talk through briefly. So there's a typology here, a very simple one, which has one end of the spectrum, what we call strategic conflict actors. And now this is actually from the literature, this word strategic. And what we're talking about here are groups which are trying to achieve a specific political outcome, whether that's a united Ireland or an independent Kashmir or whatever. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got what in the literature are called cosmic groups. These are groups which have an objective to change the world, or to change human behavior, or to achieve some kind of very ambitious non-material objective. Now again, the word cosmic comes from the literature, from Mark Juergensma's work. But in the context of Islamist groups, it can refer specifically to a subset of violent Islamist groups which describe themselves now increasingly as Salafi jihadist groups. So this is Al-Qaeda, Islamic State and their affiliates. And I should just make a point, because it's relevant to what we're discussing today, that it would be a mistake, I think, to confuse Salafi jihadist with Salafist. It would be a very serious mistake. They're very, very different things. We can talk about that more if people are interested. And in the middle, we put groups which are Islamist, in that they are seeking to apply Islam politically, but are not themselves, if you like, trying to change the world in the same way that Al-Qaeda or Islamic State are. So that was our very simple typology, and our theory, again based on the literature, was that if you looked at these groups according to their orientation, their aims, their tactics, and how they go about getting people to join their groups, that you'd see a kind of a spectrum, and which would quite clearly differentiate these three categories from each other. So look at orientation, where the groups are pointing, what their scope is. The strategic groups, in theory, should be highly nationalistic, or at the very least focused on territory, whereas the transnational groups are less concerned about where they are and are much more interested in a global reach. Under aims, we hypothesized that the strategic groups would be highly materialistic or political. They're actually focused on achieving something in the real world today, whereas the cosmic groups will be much more about propagating a worldview or spreading their ideas. Under tactics, and particularly in relation to violence, the strategic groups, we thought, should be instrumentalist. In other words, they're using violence very clearly as a means to an end, whereas the cosmic groups will be using violence much more expressively. In other words, violence is a good thing in and of itself. It's worth doing for its own sake. And in terms of how they get people to join their groups, we thought that the strategic groups will be much more about recruitment. They will be about trying to identify people to join them and seeking to bring them into their groups, whereas the cosmic groups will be much more about radicalization, to use the word that is very current in this discussion, which you might also call proselytization. So they're using influence and propaganda to encourage people to either join or to simply subscribe to their worldview. So that was the theory that we drew from looking at the literature. But when we looked in some detail at our 3 case studies, in which we looked at both Islamist groups and, where we could, non-Islamist groups to do a comparative study, we actually found that the picture was much more complex and messy than this would suggest. So this, and I apologise for this being a slightly chaotic diagram, but in some ways the chaos here is the point. This is what happened when we tried to plot some of the Islamist groups that we researched as part of our 3 case studies. We tried to plot those on the schematic which we drew up from the theory. And the key point that I want to emphasize here is that very orderly spectrum, if you like, from nationalist to transnational, from materialistic to ideological, etc., doesn't really work. In other words, these groups are not as clearly categorizable as we might expect from reading the literature. So there's a couple of things that I would highlight in particular that comes out of this particular chart. I don't know how visible it's going to be on the screens that you're that you've got available to you, but we plotted ISIL, Islamic State, as covering the full extent of the spectrum on all 4 dimensions. So, in other words, not only is ISIL a global, transnational, cosmic group, if you like, in terms of its scope, but it's also a highly localized nationalist group which is focused very strongly on achieving geographical and geopolitical objectives. Similarly, with its aims, it is clearly an ideological group in terms of its attempts to spread a worldview, but at the same time, it is actually trying to achieve very specific things on the ground, particularly in Syria and Iraq. Similarly, with its use of violence, it uses violence clearly expressively, and we can see that very clearly in some of its propaganda. But at the same time, it's using violence on the battlefield in a very instrumental way. It's trying to achieve particular battlefield objectives. And in terms of recruitment and radicalization, clearly, from the European perspective, this is a radicalizing group that is attempting to proselytize, including in Western Europe. But we don't think that ISIL would be able to attract the tens of thousands of fighters, which it clearly has been able to attract, if it wasn't also able to recruit, if you like, on the ground in the areas in which it's militarily strong. So, in a very stark way, we thought that Islamic State offered a challenge to the theory. But even if you look at some of the other groups that we examined in our case studies, we felt that they didn't situate themselves very neatly on the schematic. So a group like Al-Shabaab in Kenya, which Martina has studied for some years, in theory, because of its allegiance to Al-Qaeda, ought to be on the right-hand side of most of this this diagram. In actual fact, we think is, particularly in orientation and in tactics, is much more like a nationalist separatist group than it is a global jihadist group. And indeed, the scope of operation of groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram tends to be at best regional, if not highly local. Now, I should probably add a caveat here that this isn't definitive. This is, if you like, a work in progress. We're not saying that we've got the positions of these groups exactly right on these spectrums, but we think the broad point, which is that they are occupying a much wider position and are operating in a more dynamic way than they're often given credit for. We think those are, if you like, good conclusions to come from our study. So why is this important? Well, there's 3 points that I would make. The first is that if you focus on the ideology, which Western policymakers, I think, are particularly prone to do, then I think you miss half the picture. The second point is that one thing you miss in particular is that Islamist violent groups are not just the product of ideology, whether we want to call that religious ideology or not. They are also the products of failures of governance in the countries in which they're strong. And that was a point that came out very strongly from our case study research, that in every case there were significant governance failures which explained the rise of these violent groups. And the third point, which comes on to what we then do in a development context, is that even with a group like Islamic State, you can, and we would suggest you should, deal with the so-called push factors, things such as political grievances, as well as the other consequences of failures of governance. You should deal with the push factors as well as the pull factors of ideology, etc. So that brings me on to my final slide, which was an attempt by us to then try to draw out the implications in a way that could be easily summarized. And we thought that implications kind of operated at 3 levels of intervention: preventative interventions, ameliorative interventions, so these are interventions which are designed to make a bad situation better, and transformative interventions if those are possible. And if we start at the preventative level, what we're talking about here is, to a very large extent, is countering violent extremism activity of the kind that Martina has just been talking about in the STRIVE Horn of Africa program. But there's also an emphasis here on good governance, which is clearly something that's not confined to development activity in relation to violent extremism. But our conclusion was that interventions that promote good governance and state capacity through building or rebuilding government institutions, that those are going to be hugely important in preventative activity for violent extremism, in addition to all the other good things that they potentially bring. At the ameliorative level, one of the things that we would emphasize here is the opportunity to focus on reducing the appeal of violent extremist groups. So things which could be considered in a development context include strengthening delivery of public services in, for example, in opposition-controlled areas where there's civil conflict. Programming that seeks to address social and political grievances, so addressing the social and economic conditions that both give rise to but are also created by violence. Activities focused on building and restoring governance vacuum, including in opposition controlled areas. And something that we think is very important and sometimes falls under the CV category is reducing the risk of counterproductive governmental and military responses through, for example, security sector reform. Because on the one hand, we're saying that that strengthening state capacity is a good thing, but clearly there are risks that you can strengthen state capacity, if you like, in the wrong way, in a way that makes the state strong in a counterproductive sense. And finally, at the top, the most difficult bit, and the bit which arguably is least evident in the real world, are transformative interventions. But we think there are some examples, not perhaps very strongly evidenced in our case studies, but examples where situations have been transformed for the better or have potential to be transformed for the better. For example, in the southern Philippines, the peace process there has seen government negotiating with strategic groups in order to achieve a peace settlement. But in addition to negotiation, there are also opportunities potentially to take advantage of the splits that very frequently form even within the most cosmic or utopian groups, and looking for rival or potential breakaway groups that themselves may be open for negotiations. So that gives you an idea of the main findings that came out of our study. I'll stop there, hand it back for questions, but I'll be very happy to talk in more detail about any of that material which I've just shown. Thank you. Okay,
that's great, Andrew. Thank you very much. We've had slight questions come in as well. Can I remind everyone that you're please, feel free to make more to pose more questions. You just have to type them into the chat, and I will raise them with the presenters. We've had, I'll start with Sara. We've had a question from Mark about the capacity of religion to contribute to peace processes, and what is the evidence on this? Right. I think.
Yeah, here the evidence is numerous but also limited at the same time, because the majority of faith-based actors who have been involved in conflict resolution tend to have come from a Christian tradition. Many happen to be from the Mennonite tradition. There is also groups from within the Catholic tradition, as well as some from the Anglican. And the work that they've done has been very relevant in that, as I said, whenever religious leaders mobilize, they are able to reach out very widely, because they tend to come from an authoritative position, and therefore, by automatically, they are sort of well respected. When it comes to faith-based NGOs, they tend to connect more with the grassroots level. And the work that all these groups have done is appreciated by the communities involved in the conflict, but to the extent to which the conflict is sort of reduced. So it's more in the area of what Andrew was calling, I think, ameliorative. There is no evidence to support that faith-based actors are the only sort of actors to involve to ease a conflict altogether, because their contribution is helpful to the extent to which they participate in a myriad of other efforts that are carried out by diplomats, by policymakers, and so to the extent that also the people who are responsible for the process are also involved. A lot of this conflict resolution at the hand of faith-based actors has taken place, in fact, in Africa, some in Northern Ireland and in Bosnia and in Herzegovina, but never, in particular, in these European regions, because the conflicts were never also explicitly only characterized as religious conflicts. The role of faith-based actors were always, in a way, marginal, to contribute to, in particular, processes of transitional justice, processes of truth commissions being set up. This was also the case in South Africa. But it is very important that the policy machine and the diplomatic machine are aware of the existence of these avenues of interfaith work that can help, in a way, society come together around shared religious values, or around shared principles that are existing across various religious traditions. But the religious actors alone are never able to resolve a very hard and very practical and material issues around control of local resources, around access to political power and things like that, which are normally at the heart of any conflict, religious or not religious.
Okay, that's great. Could I just ask a related question, which is that you've said that many conflicts are driven by other factors, for example, as Andrew referred to as well, governance failures or service delivery failures, but then religious terminology, religious leaders or political leaders using religious terms and language sort of come in. Have you noticed, is there a marked difference, or is there evidence for a marked difference in when you talk about conflict resolution, if you have a conflict that has become worded in religious terms, as opposed to one that stays political, nationalistic, is there a difference in terms of trying to resolve those? Is it harder to resolve a conflict that is worded in religious terms?
I'm not too sure that it is harder. There is another element to consider whenever a religious claim is at play. But the dynamics in terms of competition for power and also how the existing administrative institutions work or do not work, those are key features of any conflict that need to be addressed. So I very much agree with what Andrew was saying in terms of the efforts to facilitate governance structures to address those structural dynamics. As long as addressing other issues. It may be that cultural dimensions and nationalistic claims are very relevant in one conflict, and religious features are on the surface very dominant in another conflict. But at the end of the day, most conflicts are about those nationalist and materialistic elements that were highlighted by also my co-presenters.
Okay, thank you. Right, we've had two related questions, which I'm going to sort of merge together on recruitment. Sorry, one is from Nadra. It's a question for Andrew. What tools and strategies are transnational groups like ISIL using to recruit people outside of their traditional bases, and how successful have they been? And we've got a related question from Marja, which is about the role of, you referred to recruiters, but she's asked about the role of self-radicalization, people accessing material from the internet or the peer groups that they mix with. What role do they play in sort of recruiting people or sort of turning people towards extremist ideologies and actions? Maybe Andrew, you could start, and then Sara and Martine, you could add something if you want.
Yeah, so to reach beyond core areas, I mean, I presume that means like geographically, you know, out of the heartlands in the Middle East. But I mean, the obvious answer is through proselytization, various kinds, which is today particularly facilitated by social media. And it's important, I think, to kind of put social media in perspective here, which is that sometimes you hear people talk about groups like Islamic State, and you think that somehow, an application like Twitter is responsible for actually radicalizing individuals. And clearly that's not the case. It's not the medium that is, if you like, the agent of radicalization. It's actually the groups that sit behind it. But nevertheless, social media, I think, has provided an extraordinary opportunity to a group like Islamic State, which simply would not have been available in years previously. In that it can create what you might call a disaggregated or distributed propaganda model. So back in the old days, a violent group would be reliant on a small number of leaders and propagandists to get its information out into the public domain, which clearly will constrain the bandwidth that is available to that group. What I think Islamic State has realized, probably more than any other group currently, is that the great advantage of social media is that you can allow people, even ones who have got very little to do directly with your organization, you can allow them to distribute and to amplify your own propaganda. So once you, if you like, get it out into social media, then others will, if you like, pick up the task and move it on. So what you end up with is a group which not only is it managing to operate as a terrorist organization and as a proto-state in its heartland, and as a guerrilla movement in the areas, if you like, on the margins of its so-called state, but it's also able to operate globally as a kind of countercultural cultural movement, which I think is not in itself unprecedented, but I think it's the combination of those four things. But I can't think of a similar organisation that's managed to operate on those four levels. And I think a fairly sophisticated, but not not necessarily groundbreaking, but fairly sophisticated use of social media has been hugely significant in allowing it to become a countercultural movement. But so I have to say, probably just as a point to finish on this, that by allowing social media to amplify propaganda, one thing that has been kind of an unforeseen consequence of this for governments, particularly in the West, is that they themselves become, perhaps unwittingly, and if like mainstream media, unwittingly becomes an amplifier for the violent group's propaganda. So it's rare to open a newspaper and to turn the TV on these days without seeing something about Islamic State. That's brought it into the consciousness of people in a way that even a group like Al-Qaeda would have struggled to achieve in previous years. And I think that in itself is something that is proving to be quite significant in terms of proselytization and radicalization. At the same time, and I really will finish now, but at the same time, we must keep this in perspective. You know, we're talking about hundreds or low thousands in the UK, for instance, which is still, in the great scheme of things, a very small proportion of any section of the population.
Okay, that's great. Sara, Martine?
Yes, I wanted to elaborate on an element that perhaps has been bypassed today. That is the psychological dimension of the people that do embrace the path of radicalization. Because, you know, we can have an ideology that is very well structured and elaborate. We can have social media working very well. But at the end, sorry, yes, it is working. Sorry, my microphone. At the end of the day, we have to consider the raw material that exists, that is the psychologies of the people, the young people that do decide to engage with these radical groups. And from research that is being carried out by other colleagues in America and also here in Oxford, I believe, it seems that if you start taking this psychological approach, you do realize that there are cognitive shifts that happen in the people prior to embracing a radical path. Cognitive shifts facilitate the individuals to become open to receive the ideological framework that has been, for instance, produced by ISIS. So it appears that you need to have the raw material in the sense of people who are already out there looking for purpose, for a vision, for something to fill their life. And so this cosmic order this cosmology that we've all been talking about, that is emanating from religious traditions, plays out very well in the radical ideologies that have been propagated by ISIS and their affiliates. And so this is what is then filling the gap that exists in the minds, in the biographies of the young people that do engage with this, that decide to live in, for instance, Europe and go and fight in Syria or in Iraq. I believe that perhaps the motivating factors of mobilizing people, maybe young people in Africa, in Somalia, or maybe in Nigeria are slightly different. Maybe there you do have some more material reasons at play as well. But in the European, in the Western context, these social and psychological dimensions have to be taken into account.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question on recruitment.
Can I answer the question?
Oh, yeah, please. Sorry. Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think in the role of internet and recruitment and social media, I always see this as a very good lens to articulate exactly how different an individual it is. I think, okay, first of all, the idea of self-radicalization, we don't see it much here in the Horn of Africa, at least. It's always a combination of, as Sarah is saying, someone looking for meaning, perhaps online, perhaps through their peers, perhaps through their religious leaders, but combined, it's rarely something that happens on its own. And what the recruiters are doing, they're studying how these guys are communicating. So at universities, it's on Twitter, like here in Kenya, for example. Whereas in more rural communities, it's WhatsApp because it requires less bandwidth. In other areas where there's not even electricity, it's other communication forms. So the recruiters come from those communities and they're studying how these guys are are communicating, and they are utilizing their communication platforms to further their messages, and they're able to politicize, genuine local grievances and governance issues, and link them up to global ideas, and that's how they sort of stick together the recruitment message and use it on social media, face-to-face, on the phone, whatever. So I think it's always about understanding the use of these tools are just using whatever the youth are doing anyway to then further their messages. That's at least how I see it here in the Horn of Africa.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. One final question on recruitment before we turn to, efforts to counter this. This is a question from Fargoon, and he asked, is there any evidence to show that forced migration increases the likelihood of refugees being recruited by ISIL and other violent groups? Anyone start with? Feel free to jump in.
I'll jump in with a kind of don't know yet, but I mean, I've not seen any evidence of the connection between, if you like, radicalization and migration, and this has become a kind of very politicized topic in the West for obvious reasons. But in theory, you would expect refugees, particularly in refugee camps, to be highly vulnerable for all sorts of reasons. Not least because the one thing that we know, if radicalization is a concept that has any kind of merit, it operates on a social level. So you are more likely to become radicalized if you've got radical friends, for instance. But anything that brings people, particularly vulnerable people, together geographically is likely to increase the risk. And yet, having said that, I don't think I've seen anything that suggests that there are particular vulnerabilities in relation to refugees, or that we've seen any kind of blowback from the migration crisis.
I would like to come in on this. I agree that there is no evidence that actually the people who are actually traveling to Europe then become radicals. But on the other hand, there is indirect evidence to suggest that the treatment of migrants and refugees in Europe will then reflect upon the perceptions that are developed outside of Europe of Europeans. So whenever cases of discriminations, of attacks against the refugees and migrants happen in Europe, this provides ammunition to groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIL to argue that then Europe hates Muslims, and Europe is a country that has to be purged from the corruption and the lack of values and religious, the fact that Europeans have abandoned any religion altogether. So it is an indirect link in terms of how grievances then are shaped, and the kind of evidence that is available to insist on particular grievances, whether they are real or perceived. Because we have to remember that very often part of the whole ideological apparatus that groups like ISIL develop are not necessarily working around criticizing realities, but they reinforce perceptions, and perceptions are very powerful in conflicts. Many conflicts, in fact, we could argue, have been shaped by and defined by how perceptions have characterized groups, in and out groups.
I think.
Sorry, Martine, go ahead.
Yes, I think just to add to that, I think we should also look at the different stages in the migration process. Because at least when Somalis, for example, leave South Central Somalia, they're fleeing terrorism, they're fleeing excessive use of violence. But of course, then when they are based in a refugee camp for 5-10 years, that's where they become vulnerable. And as Sarah is saying, of course, also how treatment of refugees at home can feed back into that cycle. So perhaps we have to look at the different stages in the process to understand it further. There's not just one answer to that question, I would argue.
Okay, Andrew, did you want to add something?
No.
Okay, all right. I'm gonna, because we're sort of Well, actually, I'll take one more. There's one more question here, which is kind of related to factors that drive extremism. It's from Mana Faroui, and she's basically saying that, which is a point I think you've made, which is that there are many other factors other than religion and ideology which are involved in pushing people to join, extremist group. Pragmatic factors, for example, in Syria, and she says, I wonder how a theoretical framing of the role of religion in creating or mitigating violent extremism can be flexible enough to allow for these nuances to be included in the analysis. So how do we make sure we don't overestimate ideology and we ensure that these other triggers are included as well? Maybe Sara?
Yes, in the paper that I wrote prior to this package, a paper I wrote for the British Academy, we did try to provide some form of theoretical framework in that we try to break down the understanding of religion into actors, ideas, and scriptures, so that the analysis of the relevance of religion in conflict and peace building can be conducted in different layers at different stages, and so the different elements can be analyzed. I think it's sort of impossible, in my view, at least I did not want to engage in this effort. There's no point in trying to provide yet another definition of religion. I think that's sort of irrelevant. The important thing is to try to be pragmatic, because in this particular context of helping policymakers to address issues around religion and violence. So it's a matter not of trying to define in another abstract way what religion is about, but trying to break it down into real concrete elements that then can be addressed separately or together in a coherent sort of overarching answer.
Okay. Martine, Andrew, did you want to add anything on that?
Well,
yeah.
I would just second the general point that Mana is making, that it's not all about ideology. Clearly, from what from the presentation that I gave, I'm sure that's clear. But I don't think ideology and religion, if you like, are red herrings either. I mean, it can often seem that way when you're looking at the very individual level. And one of the things that is, I think, quite interesting in terrorism research, that psychologists often say that they find surprisingly little evidence of ideology in the individuals that they talk to. And yet, if you talk to political scientists who look at terrorism, they say, no, it's all about ideology, because how can a group exist and mobilize and persist and have a kind of propagandizing effect and all the other things that happen at the kind of political level? How can that all happen if you don't have an animating idea or worldview at the center of it? And in a way, I think this is just an argument between two disciplines, between psychology and political science. They're both right. It just depends at which level you're choosing to look at the problem. And I think for those who I suspect Mana might fall into this category, who tend to see, if you like, think from a very grounded level, to see have a lot of contact with individuals, that ideology can often seem like something that's quite remote and not part of the lived experience of the vulnerable individuals you might be talking about. But I think for others who are looking, for example, at, say, the propaganda impact of a violent group, I think it's a very different story. That actually ideology does suddenly become very salient. And I suspect it also has a varied impact depending on what level within a group that you're looking at. So for individuals who are, if you like, recruits or volunteers, they may be recruited, or they may have volunteered because they need the money, or because they haven't got any other options, or because there's another army coming down the road and this one they just joined looks like the stronger one, and all the other reasons that those who see violent extremism in conflict scenarios can point to why people might join a violent group. But if you look at the leadership of these groups, then I think it would be perverse to say that they are not animated by ideology. One of the reasons why individuals become kind of violent entrepreneurs is because they are very strongly animated by the need to propagate a worldview. So I think it's still important, but as Mana's question, I think, very rightly emphasises, it's it's important, but in a very nuanced way, and it's very complex.
Okay, I'm going to move on now to how do we address these issues. We've had two questions which are looking at sort of both aspects of it. One is from Marja, and seems to focus on developing countries. So how effective is it to tackle marginalization and social inequalities when you're trying to prevent radicalization? So that kind of refers to the governance and other failures that you've all referred to. And then sort of the other side of this maybe is the role of the diaspora. What approaches can be taken or have been developed to reach out to people there in the diaspora to counter extremism? Anyone? Martine?
Yeah, sure. I think the question of marginalization, it's very important in the conversations that is going on in, the development space and the more security space. And I think different actors have different roles to play in addressing different aspects of the problem. There's no one actor can engage on the whole problem alone. So I think we have to look at that from different perspectives. I would argue that addressing marginalization own terms, and it has to be addressed. It has to be addressed by the host government and furthered by the international community with its assistance. But if we're looking at it from an objective of reducing recruitment and radicalization and countering violent extremism, we have to be more focused than that. We have to look at how the marginalization is being articulated by the recruiters and used in the recruitment narrative, and who are the ones who are susceptible for those particular messages. And then we have to think about what activities we can do with those individuals. But just to emphasize, that does not mean that we should not address the bigger problem, and we should not spend a lot more resources on addressing the bigger problem, because that's a genuine problem in and of itself. And I assume the diaspora question was perhaps also to some extent to us. We are looking at the Somali diaspora in terms of who are the ones propagating and accepting use of violence. So in particular, when it's very common for Somalis that when they are in their teenage years, they will come back to Somalia or to other family members in the region to become refamiliarized with their religion, with their clan, with their language, with their cultural identity. Some of them are willing, some of them are doing it of their own free will, some of them are forced by their parents and their passports are taken off them while they're staying. So there's also the interaction between diaspora and regional or local born Somalis in my case. And what I think in terms of the approach is that we have to see these things as being extremely connected. We are working in Somaliland with projects that brings the diaspora youth and the Somaliland born youth together to try and discuss what are our values, what does it mean to be Somali, how does religion come into play, what does clan mean in all of this, to try and further their relationships. There's this assumption that Somalis who are born in Europe or in America who come back to Somaliland are at risk of being recruited when they come to Somaliland mosques and duksis or madrasas and other religious institutions. But our research shows that actually it's very much more often that it's the diaspora who are more willing to accept use of violence. They might not be as conservative in their cultural and everyday life, but in accepting violence, they're a little bit more prone to accept that. So I think the essence is that we need to understand how these things fit together, and accept that it's extremely connected. How people are treated in Europe or in America, as well as how the situation are in the region we're talking about. Yeah.
Okay, Andrew, Sara, did you want to add anything there?
Maybe in general, I believe that social inequalities should always be addressed, and addressing the problem of marginalized communities, of course. And to a certain extent, I accept what, for instance, the Channel program is trying to do in this country in relation to stemming radicalization. Yet, I believe that there are a lot of dangers and risks associated with doing Channel initiatives where social work basically is offered to groups or individuals who are identified as problematic, and then the rest of society is left behind. So whichever approach to stemming radicalization we want, it has to sort of be incorporated in the whole of society. And I believe that any positive contribution to address social inequalities will benefit everybody, and it won't be just a strategy to prevent radicalization. It will have a sort of positive domino effect onto a number of social problems that can be affecting the health sector, that can be affecting the education sector, and so on. So I am a strong supporter of the need to tackle social inequalities in the context of addressing radicalization, but beyond that. So in a way, I think it would be very limited and counterproductive even to only tackle social inequalities because we are afraid of particular groups potentially falling into the trap of radicalization. Because then you may help or further marginalize them even by sort of making them feel part of a particular problem group. And at the same time, you could trigger also competing feelings among other groups who are not receiving help in terms of addressing their social problem.
Okay, I'm going to move on if that's okay, because we've got a lot of few other aspects that I'd like to cover if we have time. This is for Andrew and Martine, and it's actually related to the point you just made, Martine, about the fact that there are lots of different actors who have to be involved in countering violent extremism and the appeal of these groups. This is a question from Miranda, who focuses on senior government actors. So how do you get senior government actors on board in a preventing or countering violent extremist approach? And what are the most successful strategies for getting government buy-in? So Martine or Andrew?
Can I start, Andrew, or do you want to start?
Yeah,
okay. So from my perspective, I'm assuming we're talking about governments where the place is happening, and so for me, I know the most about the Somali government, the structures that are there, and the Kenyan government. I think the most successful is when we are keeping it a bit close to the issue. So if it's an education-related approach, it has to be Minister of Education. If it's a religious-related approach, it has to be Minister of Religion. If it's a security-related approach, it has to be the bodies that deals with security. So we have to work from the expertise and the experiences that these particular line ministries have and build in our strategies and policies. And that's certainly something that we are not always that good at doing. But your first part of your question was around the county level or lower level. I think it's absolutely crucial that we bring in national level. And it's at that level the security-related decisions are taken. At least in Kenya, one of the key drivers, of course, is excessive use of force by law enforcement actors. So if we're not engaging with the heart of the problem at the highest possible level, it's not that effective. So in whatever ways we can, we should engage in developing CVE strategies, having conversations around how we tackle these issues. But I think also I appreciate that any government around the world is trying to figure out how do we address this problem. It's not as if the UK or Denmark have got it right in how we address these problems and can then help, countries of the South. I think the way it works best, at least in my experience, is when we get experts together to try and discuss how have they approached these problems wherever they're coming from, and then developing the policies together. So a very, expert to expert or government official to government official in that particular place, that's where they get the best conversations. But definitely national level engagement is extremely important.
Okay. Andrew, did you want to add anything on that?
Only to add the possibly bleak point that I think this is a particularly difficult area in the field of CVE. Obviously, it depends to a very large extent on the government in question, but governments all over the world, not just in the South, have got all sorts of incentives, I think, not to play along, if you like, with CVE initiatives, particularly where one of the things that CVE is kind of built on is the theory that you need to mobilize civil society organizations as opposed to government structures in order to help solve the problem. And in lots of countries, and again, this isn't just in the global South, civil society organizations are perceived as being part of the problem, not as part of the solution. And I think there are lots of other reasons why governments may be unwilling to allow, for example, donors to get into direct contact with civil society organizations. But I think this is really, really hard, and it's like several of the other global problems that people are struggling to deal with, which require international action where lots of the governments concerned may not have that much of an incentive to always to do the right, what we would perceive as the right thing. But it's a bit like other questions like corruption. How do you persuade a government which doesn't see it as in its best interest to support a CVE initiative? I don't think there's an easy answer to that. And there will be people, I suspect, in the audience of this webinar who've got first-hand experience of trying to navigate around and negotiate with governments. And this is a politically sensitive area in lots of different dimensions, and that is always going to make it tough. My only suggestion is try to identify individuals in governments who you can work with, and always impress upon interlocutors that if there's a problem, that it simply does not make sense to try to exclude civil society from that.
I'm going to related aspect, which is that we talked about national level governments and top, government leadership. The other sort of very increasingly important actor in this is the donor community, which obviously has a big interest in working to support this. And Jeremy asked the question about referring to the many different factors that are involved, sort of push factors and pull factors in driving people towards extremism. He asks, do donors understand enough about the complexity to act effectively? And if not, what does the donor community need to do to get their own house in order before they can intervene with others? Anyone? Okay, Sara, would you like to start on that?
Yeah. I think, this is a valid question, and it is true that very often, corruption issues need to be addressed, or how donors engage with governments who are maybe preventing freedoms in particular countries is then inhibiting the real work they can do. At the same time, I believe that nowadays the sort of evidence on how radicalization, what kinds of avenues are there for radicalization, what kind of pull and push factors exist in particular societies. There is a wide availability of literature, of case studies. So I think in a way donors are not excusable if they don't prepare themselves when they go into the field. So they are expected to be aware, and because there is free access to materials, for instance, such as the materials we have authored for this particular project. And I think so in a way donors are more aware now, and they have more tools at their disposal than in the past to be cautious of which kind of avenues to tread. To relate this in a way to the previous question, though, there are situations where donors are sort of tied with their hands, I believe, because in countries, I don't know, for instance, like Egypt, the fight against extremism has been heavily politicized as a strategy to, in a way, enhance further authoritarianism after the Arab Spring, as opposed to, helping society to be freer. So sometimes donors are tied, and they have a very difficult position to negotiate with the authorities and yet operate on the ground. So even if they are fully aware of the risks around the area in which they're working.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I also wanted to make a comment.
Please,
I think it's, do they know enough? I think unfortunately it's very hard to know enough, or when is enough enough. I think all of us, because the problem is so complex and keep changing, all of us keep learning about it as we are going along, and it would be very hard to say when is then enough enough. It's extremely complex, and of course we have to engage it with caution. I think from the perspective that I see it is that donors sometimes have to build in more flexibility in their programming and allow for more research, as in not only having a big research assuming before the program now we understand everything and then we can engage perfectly. This is like a balancing act of trying assumptions, adjusting, making small mistakes, moving forward. So maybe it's more about thinking, how do we build in the best possible thinking about, one, how do we do the least harm, and how can we make sure that we learn the most as we are going on. So perhaps it's more about how we structure the programs to build in our own opportunity to learn as much as we can about the complex situation as we implement our programs. My experience in working with the donors is very often that those who are doing the programming do not necessarily have the time to understand as much about the political nature of the problem, whereas those who engage on political issues don't have the financial capacities to do something about it. So there's also something about how our engagement overseas is structured that is being challenged a little bit by this field, because it requires that all of these things come together. Another point I wanted to make on how we engage is I think it's extremely important for international actors to be a little bit realistic about how they are perceived. Us being funded by the European Union has given us some opportunities, and in other ways we are a bit restrained, where the other donors like the Danish government, the American government, the British government, they have a different room for maneuver because of the history in the region, because of how they're perceived. So I think that's important for them to, be realistic about, given who we are and how we are perceived, how can we engage on this agenda because it's so political. Yeah.
Okay, Andrew, would you like to add something?
Only to endorse Martine's points.
That's great. Right, I think we've got time for one more very quickly. This is a question from Abdul Hamid Salem, and he talks about the impact really of the rise of violent extremism groups, extremist groups, which he says has actually restricted the space for faith and non-faith based NGOs, INGOs, to engage in the humanitarian work and in the humanitarian sector. And he asks, and of course that he says that in itself makes young people in particular more vulnerable to the appeal of such groups. So what can be done, or what is being done to address this? Maybe Sara?
Well, to keep providing avenues for young people who are wishing to participate in humanitarian work, that's very important. Well, I'm sure that faith-based mobilization has been restrained, because I am aware of various Muslim groups that have been active in Syria, and I do know people that did go, and this was done with the blessing of DFID. So there are avenues. It's important perhaps to multiply the kind of avenues that are available out there. I do agree that perhaps even the fact that there is a perception that religious Muslim groups have been hampered, this in itself, even if it's not widely spread, the sole perception could be dangerous and could have knock effects in that, and it could, yes, indeed, enhance the feelings that among Muslim youth, that they have been marginalized, have been prevented from participating in society, and so on. So we have to be very much aware of working and operating on all sorts of levels, and to deal with perceptions, as I said earlier, and not just with hard facts, because unfortunately propaganda works on perceptions.
Yeah. Andrew, would you like to add anything? Or Martine?
I'm just sort of trying to think through how you might open up that open up the space if it is being restricted. I mean, I think I'd agree that it is, particularly in some of the regions which are most affected by the problem. So therefore, it really is an issue. I think I would just come back to what I said previously. Identify specifically faith-based civil society organisations as being ones which we need to do whatever we can to ensure that governments don't try to restrict the space. And political pressure, for example, potentially could be brought to bear. But I wouldn't want to pretend that this is in any way easy, because again, for all the things that I mentioned previously, this is a particularly sensitive area, and governments are not always going to be your best friend in this respect.
Yeah. Okay. Martine, did you want to?
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't completely thought through my answer, but I think intuitively here in the Horn of Africa, religion is extremely powerful, and I would argue that nationally or local-based organizations that are faith-based, they actually very often have a different space of engaging in comparison to people like us who are perceived to be atheistic or non-religious or perhaps Christian in one way or the other. So actually here I think that some of the types of interventions that can only be led by religious organizations because they're the only ones that have legitimacy in the area, but because they're tied so much into the local politics, they also have their own interest and their own standpoint. So from our perspective in working with those organizations as partners, that's the challenge we are facing, to try and unpack what are they trying to achieve. Okay, yes, they believe in tolerance and interfaith dialogue and these things at a top level, but at a more local level, what are they trying to achieve? Is it a resource question? Is it a political influence question? How does that all fit together, and what does that mean for the way that we should engage with them?
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We've actually run 3 minutes over time. So I'm going to firstly thank everyone who listened in and asked the really interesting questions. It's been great to get so much sort of interest from everyone. A very big thank you to our 3 presenters, Sara Silvestri, Andrew Glazzard and Martine Zeuthen. And just a reminder to everyone that the reading packs are available on our website, the GSDRC website, and this webinar will also be very shortly uploaded on the website as well. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.